Hello, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us on this panel about international insights on restorative justice. My name is Claire de Meserville. I am Costa Rican. I live in Costa Rica, and I'm delighted to be moderating this panel. I wanted to let you know just a couple of things before introducing our friends and panelists for today. We're going to be using the Zoom platform. So if you're joining us live, please remember to keep your sound muted while you are not speaking. We're going to have some time for comments and questions. So at that time, we're going to ask you to speak up. But in the meantime, please, if it's not your turn to speak, have your microphone muted. We're going to record this panel as well. So if you are watching this panel in a later time, the different links and resources that we mentioned here are going to be found in the description. I'm going to introduce you to our speakers today. We're going to have a very interesting panel with Arti Mohan. Arti, can you please wave or raise your hand so we see you? Arti is a former lawyer. She has worked on a restorative justice pilot design and implementation. She develops restorative justice related research, writing, and training. And we're so happy to have you. I'm going to also introduce Miguel Tello. Miguel, can you raise your hand, wave? Miguel is the executive director of the Strachan Foundation, a family foundation that supports education and health projects throughout Central America. Miguel is also an adjunct professor of the International Institute of Restorative Practices. He offers restorative practices training and consulting to a variety of NGOs, schools, churches, and criminal justice professionals in Central America. In addition, he facilitates workshops on restorative justice and circles and teaches an online course on outcome measurement for the Center of Executive Leadership at the University for Peace in Costa Rica. He holds master's degrees in public administration and international studies from the University of Washington in Seattle. Miguel is originally from Mexico. He currently lives in Costa Rica with his wife and 2 sons. I will also say that he has been a friend and a mentor, and Miguel, is just so good to have you here. And it is my honor also to introduce Paulo Moratelli. Paulo is a psychologist. He is the delegate for Brazil of the Scientific Society of Restorative Justice from Spain and member of the Global Advisory Council of Restorative Justice International in the USA. Paulo is member of the European Forum for Restorative Justice body of instructors. Paulo is an independent instructor of peacemaking circles certified by Cape Canis since 2012 and of transformative dialogues and transformative circles, which is a method of his own authorship, working through the country and abroad, teaching courses also in Spanish and English. And welcome, Paulo, it's so good to have you. I know that we're all familiar with technology, but just to say that we are here from India, Costa Rica, Brazil, and from the different places where our friends are joining us, feels like magic to me. It's just very weird times that we live, and this is one of the gifts that these times offer us. If you are joining us to witness this conversation and participate in it, please put in the chat where are you from, and why did you decide to join this panel? So put that on the chat so we can say hello to you as well. So before we go deep on the wonderful things that you all do, I thought that we could start with a go around, with a question for all. And I suggest let's start with Paulo, followed with Arti, followed by Miguel. Let's do that, our first initial circle. What brought you to restorative justice? Paulo, let's start with you.
Okay, hi everyone. Claire, as I have always worked as a psychologist with people in social vulnerability, with people who are marginalized, fragile, and conflict with themselves, with their communities, and with the justice system. As soon as I got to know the ideas and practices of restorative justice, it was in 2010, I became interested on the potential for social transformation that I perceived in this field. And as I have always worked with groups and collectives, it was natural for me to start using these new methods for me. However, since the beginning, as I have always worked in complex cases and serious crimes, such as homicides, gender and domestic violence, sexual violence, and with children and adolescents in government shelters, juvenile justice, and etc., I had to make adjustments and adaptations in these methods so that I could guarantee the safety of the participants and the achievement of positive results in the cases in which I attended. At first, what stimulated me the most was my curiosity and an uncertainty that those ideas and practice could actually work in the real world. And that's why I made myself available to act in legal proceedings, schools, prisons, communities, public and private companies, in short, in all spaces where opportunities and the need for my work arose. As in Brazil, even today, we do not have laws that prohibit us from working with restorative practices in any type of case or crime. I had this fantastic opportunity to put theory and practice to the test in many and varied circumstances, obtaining results that even surprised me at first for their potential for resolution and transformation. Today, after more than maybe 1,000 of these procedures performed, and after a long evolution and development of my own method, I exclusively use what I call transformative dialogues to carry out my interventions. The objective in developing this method was to meet the needs that I perceive in the care of each case, the needs of the participants, the justice system, the community, the institution, and so on. In the last 2 years, I have been working exclusively online, not only with lectures, courses, and workshops, but also facilitating complex cases through video calls, such as through Zoom. And I realized that what I consider advantages, such as, for example, the fact that it's easier to guarantee the physical and emotional safety of participants in this online modality. And since 2020, I have attended to cases of suicidal ideation, gender violence, sexual abuse, for example, using Zoom. The results have been very, very good. And today I consider myself 100% adapted to the reality of long distance meetings via the internet. And after all, it is thanks to this possibility that, for example, we can be gathered here today, which, by the way, makes me very happy, Claire and colleagues. Thank you, Claire. I give you the floor, Claire.
Thank you so much, Paulo. I remember when the pandemic started that in Costa Rica, people from Restorative Justice said, can we do a restorative conference virtually? And we didn't know, it was so new. So thank you, Paulo. Arti, how about you? What brought you to Restorative Justice?
Thank you, Claire. Just wanted to check I'm audible.
I can hear you very well.
Perfect, yes. So I am a lawyer and I went to law school thinking that I wanted to work towards justice. And I remember in my second year of law school, I worked in a women's prison, which is one of the largest in South Asia. And as I was working with those women, my role was to understand what their prospects would be for reintegration once they were released. And as I was working with them, I saw that prison only impacted them extremely adversely. They had no place to go when they would be released, that relationships were broken. And then, of course, there was a lot of stigma that they would experience when they would be released. And that is when I began thinking, what other alternatives can we use? And interestingly, that's exactly when we had a visiting professor come in from the US and teach us a course on restorative justice. And just seeing that, because it was experiential, it was over 2 years and 4 semesters, that just made me think about how real this can be and how experientially this was something that really enriched me as a person. And then after that, the organization I work with, Council to Secure Justice. So happy to have 2 of my colleagues, Urvashi, who's the director of Restorative Justice, and Kuhu, who also works with us here. So thank you for being here, Urvashi, Kuhu. So yes, Council to Secure Justice, where I worked initially, I worked as a lawyer. So I was litigating for children who've been sexually abused. And even in that, I saw that the legal system doesn't meet the needs of victims all the time, because often the trials were really long. One particular case I was working on, I remember there was a conviction, which of course was rare because of a lot of legal difficulties. But even then I saw that needs may not have been met. And that is when, as an organization, we carried out a study to understand what is it that victims really need. And from there, we launched our restorative justice program. And that for me personally also was the reason that I thought that restorative justice may be a better way to meet needs of people who've caused harm as well as people who've been harmed.
Thank you, Artie. Miguel, how about yourself?
One word, serendipity. So my wife and I had just moved from Brazil to Costa Rica in 2003. We came to Costa Rica for a position that my wife accepted with Habitat for Humanity as the director of a training center. I was unemployed and got to be a stay-at-home dad with our infant son, who now is 20 and in the university. But at the time I was looking for work, and my father-in-law has this friend who said to me, you should get in touch with Prison Fellowship International. You have a good curriculum and I think it would be a good fit. So I contacted PFI and I met with Ron Nickel, and he said, yes, you have a great curriculum and we think it would be great, but there are no job openings right now. So I said, okay, no problem. And to my great surprise, 2 months later, I get a phone call from Dan Van Ness, the director of the Center for Justice and Reconciliation of Prison Fellowship International. And he says to me, hi, I'm Dan Van Ness. An anonymous donor is willing to pay for your salary. Would you like to be a program manager for restorative justice programs in Latin America? And I said, sure, there's just one problem. What's restorative justice? And he said, don't worry, I will teach you. And so I had the great blessing of learning restorative justice from Dan Van Ness, one of the pioneers of this movement. And I worked for them for 2 years, traveled throughout Central and South America. And then in 2005, I organized a conference on restorative justice, and we had people from 12 different Latin American countries come. And in the process, in looking for materials for the participants, I came across an article by Ted Wachtel. And I wanted to translate it into Spanish. And I wrote to him and I said, Ted, I'd like to use your article. Will you give me permission to translate it? And he said, sure, as long as you give me a copy of the translation. And I said, well, yeah, of course. And so we had our conference. And then Ted Wachtel invited me to get training at IIRP. So I received training, and I've had a relationship with IIRP since 2006. I became a certified trainer in restorative practices. At that time, I also received training from Kay Pranis, which was such a gift. I'm sure you would agree with that, Paulo. And so later on, I became a board member for IIRP. And then after that, I also became an adjunct professor of a course called Restorative Justice Global Perspectives, which I've been teaching for the past 5 years. And so that's how it came to restorative justice, pure serendipity, but an incredible blessing, and being trained and formed by amazing mentors. And now I've had the blessing of being able to transmit that to many people in Costa Rica and especially in Central America.
That's so wonderful to hear. And just to know, to always have room for that amazement and gratitude for things that came to be that didn't have to come to be. And they also allow us to be here. I think we live at a time and age where we're reconciling with so many things that are hard and daunting. It's also good to reconcile with the really wonderful things that happened, and we're grateful. I want to learn from your experiences. I know some of the things that the three of you do, and I admire them greatly. So I feel very grateful to share this space to go a little bit deeper. Artie, let me begin with you. Please tell us a little bit more about your restorative work with children and how it has evolved over the course of this past few years.
Thank you, Claire. Yes. So the study I was talking about, first we spoke with victims who had experienced sexual abuse, as well as women in communities who had experienced domestic violence, to understand what their needs were and what is it that they thought justice was. So we released a study called Perspectives of Justice. I'll share the link on that. And that guided us and laid the spadework for restorative justice. And since then, CSJ, Council for Secure Justice, has been implementing a restorative justice pilot. So we didn't start with children who've been sexually harmed, but with children in conflict with law. That is, young children who have been accused of wrongdoing and are in the legal system. So we started a restorative justice program for them. But we also saw that restorative justice might not always be the need for everyone. So that is when we started exploring other sort of restorative interventions, for instance, restorative reintegration processes. So the child and the family, they have a process. Often because the family is so angry, the child has many unmet needs. So we wanted to create a space where the child and the family can come face to face, talk about all of that. And we drew from varied models, circles of support and accountability, just circles in general. And we created a model that while it drew from best practices, also was tailored to cultural needs around here. And then since then, especially since the pandemic, we've done a lot of virtual circles, which are not necessarily restorative justice, but are circles with young children who've experienced sexual harm and are in shelter. Before the pandemic as well, we were doing in-person circles, and these are circles we still continue with children in conflict with law who are in observation. Those are homes where children stay while the inquiry is pending. So these were circles we saw that had a lot of value, and we saw that often they led up to restorative processes, but they in themselves had a lot of value because they created a safe space for children to talk about things, to be heard, to really be understood. And then we also started interweaving social emotional learning into that. Then we did circles with children who've been abused, like I said, and are in shelters. And then we expanded our restorative circle work, especially to a lot of different spaces, such as frontline workers during the pandemic. This was all virtual. Then organizational circles for another organization as well. So with children, I think one learning that's really been there for us is that while of course circles work for anyone, they work for adults, they work for children in all contexts, we've also really been mindful of adapting them with child-friendly tools. So we've used a lot of child-friendly tools in our circles, and the circle plan, we've taken the circle idea broadly, but we've also really adapted it to make a more elaborate circle plan. So we have these stages where we have games in the beginning, then we have an opening, then we have a check-in, and then we have levels of sharing. So this we created just based on the needs of children, child psychology, developmental needs. And we made sure there's space for a lot of laughter, a lot of fun, a lot of games, etc. And that's been a core thing. And then we also use a lot of art-based tools. So that's our main work with children and restorative practices. I pass it back to you, Claire.
Yeah, I do have a follow-up question because it's interesting. And on the work that you do, on the judicial work that you do, I'm very sure that Paulo will have a lot to comment on his own experience in the context of Brazil. When I work with circles with adults, usually people have a prejudice that this is kind of a childish methodology to sit in circles. We're so adult-centered. We have to be so formal, and circle feels like something that can be kind of childish. But then in practice, we think about doing circles with children, and we kind of think, oh, is this going to be too heavy for them? You know, to require for them to listen, to sit still. So you tell us about the adaptations that you have done to make circles friendly for children. What is one example or an anecdote that you think reflects that process?
Thank you for that. Yes, one very stark example, I think, is having a physical movement in the circles. Initially, we had thought about that because with adults, well, we do a little bit of movement here and there in circles, but with children, we thought that having spaces where children can actually move, maybe even play some sort of games in the circle, has been really helpful, especially with young boys, because when they come in, they have a lot of energy. And starting the circle with that, we saw could help them focus so much more. So usually with the opening, we would do some sort of running, just in space maybe, and then quickly transitioning with mindfulness. And that balance we thought was really helpful and helped a lot of children focus much more than they would otherwise do. And then just other things, you know, for instance, instead of verbal sharing, we created space for storyboarding in the circle as well. So they could just draw out whatever happened in the form of a comic strip, etc. Knowing that verbal communication is not the only form of communication.
Thank you for that. That is so important. I'm going to change gears a little bit. I would like to move it over to Miguel. Miguel, you have been working with restorative justice and restorative practices in Central America for many years and with many different organizations, with many different contexts. What are some Central American initiatives that you could share that could be of interest to our listeners and learners?
Well, thank you, Claire. Well, I would like to share a little bit about two organizations in particular, and then I would like to share a seminar that a colleague, Flor Garcia, and I developed recently. So the first organization I want to talk to is Flor's organization. Flor is a founder of this organization. She's also an IRP board member and a restorative practices practitioner. So she founded this organization called Circula, and they offer a leadership program for grassroots organizations, members from government agencies, but mostly for NGOs. And they also offer restorative practices training, and they've actually formed a collective of restorative practitioners. Well, in 2018, the Volcán de Fuego, the fire volcano, erupted and caused a lot of destruction and death. And Circula offered help with circles for people that had been displaced by the volcano. It was a very powerful methodology. I mean, it really helped people to share what they were going through, and it had a lot of healing effect, which was very different from all the other interventions that were being offered, especially by government agencies. This one really focused on listening to the people and empowering their own leadership. So it was very, very, very powerful. And so this is just like a glimpse as to the way that Circula is operating in the region. They are now called upon by different organizations to facilitate circles, sometimes in very difficult situations like sexual harassment at an organization. They help to facilitate circles for that. And so they become a contact organization for others that are seeking to implement restorative practices. Another organization that has done amazing work with restorative practices is in Nicaragua, and is called Amos Health and Hope. And they offer a community health program in rural areas of Nicaragua. It's quite impressive. They train health promoters in these small villages to be first responders. And when you compare the data, the health data of villages where Amos is working and when they're not working, for example, some years in the villages where they were working, zero neonatal mortality, morbidity and mortality of women and children also going down really, really low. But one of the things that they've done is that they've really introduced restorative practices as part of their culture. They actually have a program manager whose job it is to implement restorative practices and help the organization facilitating any circles that are needed. But one thing that I really admire about Amos is that in 2018, there was a deep political crisis in Nicaragua. Peaceful marches were repressed by the Ortega government, and I believe there was like about 400 people that were killed. There was a lot of tension in the country, a lot of tension among the staff of Amos, and they facilitated circles with their team members on a regular basis. And that absolutely helped them with their mental health, with their ability to be resilient during this time. So that's another example. And then the last thing I'd like to share with you is a seminar that Flor and I designed. And we've offered two of these seminars already, one in Costa Rica, one in Guatemala, and we're going to be offering one in Panama. And basically, it's a seminar, a leadership seminar in nature. And what we do is that we brought 10 leaders from the region to Costa Rica. We went to the mountains. We would hike in silence. We would do forest therapy. We would come back and we would have workshops on restorative leadership, what it means to be a restorative leader, especially in times of volatility, uncertainty, chaos, and ambiguity. And what are some tools that promote the health of leaders and their staff in these times of so much convulsion? And spending that time in nature made a huge impact on the leaders that were attending. We offered a second project in Guatemala just last month, and we went to some amazing places, to a sacred lake of the Mayas called Lake Chicabal. We went to a national park in Totonicapan, and once again, we hiked in silence, we did forest therapy exercises, and then we reflected on what it means to be a restorative leader. And once again, people really connected with others, with nature, with themselves, and with what it means to be restorative. So these are some examples of exciting things that are taking place in Central America. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Miguel. And I can't help to resonate with that you're saying. And I remember having a conversation with someone some time ago saying we find it so challenging to talk about restorative practices or transformative approaches when it comes to things related with climate change. But then we think, how disconnected are we from nature? How our restorative approach needs to go beyond. So I just, my head is kind of spinning. Oh, I think we lost Artie for a second. I'm sure she'll be back soon. Oh, there you are. It's good to have you back, Artie. Paulo, you've developed a methodology called transformative dialogues that I find fascinating. What are some considerations and ethical responsibilities you identify on the application of restorative justice in the Brazilian context and on our current historical times?
Well, it will be a challenge to tackle this topic in such a short amount of time, but let's focus on those central points. I think the main thing for me in the last years is try to tropicalize this idea of restorative justice to apply its philosophy, theory, practices in Brazil. So I believe that in a country like Brazil, the adoption of restorative justice should aim to generate a positive social transformation, seeking not only conflict pacification, but also the development of citizenship and the autonomy of individuals and communities. For this, understand that it is necessary to invest in development of empathy and the perception of it and exercise the otherness and respect in relationships throughout the permanence of children, adolescents in schools, and young people in universities. As I see, true pacification and social transformation happens mainly through prevention. And the central effort must take place in schools and communities. As almost all conflicts have a relational and community origin, it is in their relational and community context that they must be resolved. The idea of justice I work with is that of a transformative justice, which is capable of promoting the necessary changes individually and collectively, respecting historical, social, political, institutional, cultural contexts, and promoting the prevention of conflicts and crimes whenever is possible, and its transformation when necessary. In this sense, we must seek to do justice in accordance with universal human values, focusing on individual and collective needs, promoting the transformation of interpersonal and institutional relationships. A practice that is intended to be transformative must seek the autonomy of participants and respect their ideas, values, emotions, feelings, needs, culture, and worldview. And to put these ideas and practices into practice, it is necessary to assume a continually analytical and critical stance on your praxis. To achieve this goal, some points are central for me. Our praxis must promote the autonomy of individuals and groups, and therefore, we must reject any use of our interventions that produces what Foucault called docile bodies. We act to promote autonomy when our intervention produces reflections of the individuals in relation to themselves, to other people, and on their spaces of coexistence. When we do it, changing inappropriate and/or criminal behavior is natural and positive, brought about by reflection and self-responsibility, not threat and punishment. We acted with a decolonial thinking when we respect the values, needs, culture, and worldview of the participants. It's so much important in a place like Brazil. Consciously seeking to share power is another concern of the facilitator, who cannot emulate the functioning of the retributive justice system and exert power over the participants. So we cannot took the conflict from the real people. The facilitator must conduct his actions in a deliberately critical manner. In a country like Brazil, where violence permeates relationships in a common way, unfortunately, the facilitator must maintain a rigid search for safety in the procedures. In this context, then we talk about creating a safe space during the procedure. We must be attentive not only to the search for an emotionally safe space where dialogue is empathetic and respectful, but even before that, we must carefully check and evaluate whether it will be physically safe to promote a meeting between the parties. These participant safety issues, among many others, must be carefully evaluated in individual preparatory meetings. And finally, in countries with so much social inequality, participation of public policies in procedures is mandatory, in my point of view. This is due to the fact that many of the needs of the individuals and groups involved in this conflictive situation derive from rights and needs not satisfied by the state through its public policies. And it's not uncommon for these neglected rights and needs to be at the real root of conflict or the crime itself. To do such work, Claire, so I developed my own method, these transformative dialogues, which is a structured dialogue process centered on emotions and interpersonal relationships, which creates a safe space capable of maintaining difficult dialogues in complex and or conflicting situations in search of a consensual and prospective definition of the problematic situation. In this method can be applied as a restorative and transformative practice in dealing with conflict and crime, but also as a method of working with groups in any area. I believe that was the time I had available for now, Claire. So thank you. It's on you again.
I think we have some time to delve deeper. And the way that I would like to do that is to ask the three of you to do perhaps one, or let me know if perhaps two go arounds where I would like to listen. What is a question that you would like to ask to any one of the other two panelists? So take a second to think about that. Well, I suggest that perhaps the order we can use is similar to the one we just did. Artie, we can begin with you, followed by Miguel, followed by Paulo. And what would be a comment, a reflection, or a question that you would like to ask one of our other two speakers? So Artie, I will pass the word to you, and then we'll go to Miguel, and then we'll go to Paulo.
Thank you, Claire. I absolutely love listening to Miguel, you and Paulo, both of you. Like, I've read about both of your work, and Miguel, I've spoken to you, but it was just fascinating about the different things you spoke about. My one question was, how does the role of nature really, like I know you said that you use it for restorative leadership, where you go hiking into the mountains, etc. So how exactly does nature interweave with restorative practices? Is it because, it's reflective, there's space for all of that? But what more do you draw from? I also have a question for Paulo, but we'll come to that later.
Well, I think as Claire mentioned, we're in this modern era, we're very disconnected from nature. And yet for thousands of years, we're very much integral part of nature. And so returning to those roots has a lot to do with knowing our place in the world, knowing ourselves, and knowing that we're connected not only to one another, which is a very important principle in restorative practice, restorative justice, but that we're also connected to nature. It's a broader circle. And I think in that sense, I'm not very knowledgeable about this, but I know that there is work being done with restorative justice and the environment, restorative justice and nature. That idea of that we are connected to nature and therefore need to care for it. And I think this really came alive for those participants. So our very first day in the very first pilot project, after walking 1 hour in silence in the forest, we came to a clearing and we had our first circle. I was amazed at the depth of sharing. These were people that didn't know one another very much, and they shared with such depth and with so much emotion. I truly think that it was that hour of walking in silence that allowed for that depth to happen. So I think nature in itself allows for healing and allows for us to get to know one another better, to connect with one another. Thank you.
Thank you.
Artie, you wanted to ask another question to Paul?
Yes, please. Yes, please. I love that you said that, we need to decolonize RJ. And I think that's a concern in a lot of places here as well, something we've tried to explicitly factor in. So I was wondering how I know it's a very detailed discussion, but any practical ways that you've done it in spaces, in circle spaces, for instance, if all the participants are just focused on the facilitator and there's an inbuilt sense of hierarchy, what are things that you do? I'd love to know about that.
Thank you, Artie. One of the things that I usually do at the end of my trainings is create a dialogue, usually in the past 2 years, just online dialogues. When it's in-person meeting, we do it in circle. And we start to planning which actions we'll do afterwards this training. So I'm not in the place to tell them what they need to do. I never do that. I just ask questions. I propose questions to let them think what values they see in that practice that goes along with their values or their institution, and what practices they have to adapt to it function in their work and so on. So I created this space for them to think what they really need to do to put these ideas into practice. And I talk a lot in my trainings about philosophical and psychological aspects that goes along with a restorative meeting. For me, it's pretty much important. Claire knows about that, because a lot of stuff is happening in a circle, in a conference, or etc. that goes way beyond the script or the practice itself. A lot of things that goes along with myself and the others in the room, and including with the room. For example, how the place that we are in participates in this conversation, as Miguel was saying, it's pretty much important. And the institution, what we need to do for this institution to really try to create some identity. So one of these questions that I usually ask then, Artie, is, which is the place of restorative justice in your institution? What is the place of your institution in restorative justice? So I try to create these challenges, these reflections, because sometimes the trainings and workshops and so on, or institutions try to promote one kind of restorative justice that like one size fits all. It's not possible, especially in countries like our country. I didn't have the chance to meet to go to India. I hope I have the chance one day, but I believe we have so much in common with the inequality and so on. So it's one small example. I had the chance to participate in training with a lot of people from the States, from Canada, Europe, and etc. And a lot of times they talk about us using restorative justice and juvenile justice, and they say, "Oh, it's simple. You can do it in the community and etc. etc." And I usually ask this question: which kind of cases you attended through this process? And usually they say, "Oh, we work with violence and aggression, driving intoxicated, and etc." I said, "Oh, okay, let me talk about some of the cases that I've attended here in Brazil. 4 boys who put fire on a man, killed in that way, or 2 boys that killed another one, cut all of these members, put it on fire, and then and so on." And I start talking about this kind of violences that we had here. So we need to talk about that. How can we create our identity through those processes?
Thank you so much, Paulo, and thank you so much, Artie, for this fantastic fantastic questions. I had the opportunity to talk with Hector Valle some weeks ago, that Paulo that you know very well, and he did mention the flavor of restorative justice in Latin America is so rich, and sometimes we don't explore it fully. So I remembered that. Miguel, I'm curious about your questions that you have for the other panelists.
Thank you. So Artie, one of the things that I admire about you and that really struck me when you were speaking is your capacity for learning and adaptation. So you started by being a lawyer and realizing this is not working for what I'm seeing in the people that I want to serve. And so you introduced restorative justice. And then even as you were talking about your work with children, how you adapt practices for children, I would love to hear more about the way that you do that, because it just sounds so amazing that you're on a journey and then new branches appear. And how do you do that? What's I'd like to know what your magic is.
Thank you. I think it's been because I joined the organization at the stage when the organization was also at the start of that journey, wanted to explore if the legal system is not working well. So that's been, it's really met my personal idea of moving away from the legal system and CSJ's idea. And that's been very, very parallel. And that's been helpful for me as well. And I think organizationally as well, because when we saw that the legal system is not always working for everyone, of course, we understand that some it does, but not for everyone. We need to see what alternatives exist. And then the reason why we diversified into so many different things, I think when we started out, we were thinking solely of restorative justice. And then we saw that maybe restorative justice might not always be the best for everyone. So it was a very, we're trying to implement from here or there. We did a research on RJ across the world. We looked at all countries, all sort of best practices. I had gotten in touch with you about that as well. Yes, so we tried to see all of that, but at the same time, we were mindful that maybe not using one program as it is, because that may not work. So it was really through doing. As we went out, we did those processes and we saw that maybe, okay, not just RJ, maybe these children just need a conversation with their family. And that's where the idea of reintegration processes came up. And we drew from a lot of different processes. And even now, the way we conceptualize reintegration processes, it's not as any one specific process. It's just based on the needs of people. So we have like protocols in place, etc., which we did design. But at the same time, we are very cognizant that when we do those processes, they are very much in need of people who are in those processes. And the same with our circles, actually, even though our circles are not specifically responsive or in response to any sort of harm, but they are often in communities with children, with young people, with organizations. That's a principle that at least I really try to use, that we design it based on the needs of those particular people. And I think that's something that's been really helpful. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. And Paulo, when you started speaking, the first word that jumped out to me was tropicalization, because I've heard that many times and I've tried to understand it. And I had the blessing of living in your country for 3 years. I lived in Recife. My son was born there. And I remember very distinctly one time when we had a meeting with several partners, some from Rio Grande do Sul, Sao Paulo, Recife, Bahia. And man, you could tell a difference in the culture of these different areas of this gigantic country. And so what came to mind for me was, how do you do that tropicalization within a multicultural context like Brazil? I mean, that seems so challenging.
Yeah, it's true. It's very challenging. And the main thing, the first thing is to do it with them. It's so simple. So we had this idea so clearly. So we had to do with them. So I had the chance to travel through Brazil, running trainings and so on, including facilitating some cases. And the first thing is you have to respect your own worldview, your own values, your own cultural ways and manners, because Brazil have so many cultures. I believe India and Mexico have that as well. Costa Rica, I believe it's not so much because it's a small country. But when we have countries like Brazil or Mexico or India, there are with so many people and etc. We had this kind of stuff. In Brazil, we had suffered colonial. We have been colonized by the Portuguese people, but also from Dutch people, from people from all Europe and so on. We had a lot of people that came from Africa, unfortunately as slaves, but we have people from all around the world. We have practices and ideas and cultures that's so different. So it's pretty much simple, Miguel. It's ask them, what does ideas means to them? That's the main thing that I do. I never assume that I know what anyone needs or wants. I ask them. So most of the questions that I answer when I work as a supervisor or a consultant is ask them. Just ask them. They will tell you what they need. It's what we do. It's what restorative practices practitioners do. Ask them what they need, what they think, what they believe, and so on. So these 12 years in my life, I dedicate to that, to not knowing what they not assume that I know what they need. In 2013, I had the chance, Miguel, to have a small chat with oh my God, the adaptator of Peacemaking Circles, the judge from Canada. I can't believe I'm forgetting his name.
Barry Stewart.
Thank you, Barry Stewart. Barry Stewart came to Brazil in 2013. I have a chance to have a conversation with him, and I asked him. At that point, I have been facilitated such as 300 circles and most severe cases and etc. And I assumed that I was pretty much a skilled facilitator. So I asked him, what do you think, Barry, is the most important thing for a facilitator? I was expecting an answer very theoretical or practical or etc. And he just said to me, humility. And I said, okay, and he said, just humility. And can you explain that, please? Because it's so profound and so simple. He said, if you think that you know what the people need from you, you'll never be a good facilitator. You just have to assume that you don't know what they need, what they want, what they are seeking for. So that's it, Miguel. I believe that the first thing is to work with them, to ask them. And if you do that, you're just a part of this conversation, creating space for this conversation. You're not the one who needs to know the things.
Thank you. That's incredibly wise, Paulo. I had the fortune of having Barry Stewart and Kay Prentice stay at my home precisely before I facilitated my very first circle. And so I got advice from them.
So we had the chance to be hugged by Barry Stewart, okay?
Yes.
Barry Stewart is like a bear. He embraces you and lifts you off the floor. And it's an amazing experience to get a chance to know Barry Stewart,
Yes,
Barry Stewart.
Indeed.
And also Kay, of course.
Yeah.
Wow, how wonderful. Paulo, do you have any questions for our fantastic panelists?
Oh, of course I have. RD, you speak a little bit about the adaptations on the practice, some practical stuff that you did. And as I'm pretty much interested in this idea of tropicalization or adaptation or reality, and I wonder if you had this need to adapt the philosophy or the theory of this restorative justice ideas as also as the practices. Have you ever thought about that? Have you do that? What you can tell us about that, please?
Thank you for that. Yeah, that's a very interesting question because I think we've had a journey very closely linked with that. So when I started, I remember I used to think of, I would train in one model and I would think that is a perfect model. And I'm sure each model has like its benefits, etc. But over time, I think that's been a learning for me that yes, each model has a lot of value, but then there's no perfect fit for any context. And like you were saying, really depends on the situation. So I'll speak here more about circles because I think we've done more of circle work than actual restorative justice work. We've not done as many restorative justice cases. But for circles also, I think the principles are similar. And the thing is that instead of using any specific model of circles, we use all of the circle values, norms, the structure, but at the same time, we've been very adaptive to the way we use that. So I see it as a container, which can hold like a lot of different things. But at the same time, it really needs to honor the needs of people. For instance, sometimes people are not very comfortable with the talking piece. And initially, I would be more firm about it. That please, let's try to use it, etc. But then I also thought that in some contexts, people are just not comfortable. Maybe it's neurodivergence. Maybe sometimes it's people who are just not familiar with that sort of thing. And that was an interesting realization that at least struck me, that maybe it's not always that perfect way of seeing the talking piece that's going to happen. Even shape, for instance, I know ideally how important a circle space is, but sometimes when we've actually done circles in childcare institutions in person, there's not been enough space. So we are just in the small little crowded room and we have to sit in and over and we have to make do with that. And ideally a part of me would say, no, this is not a perfect circle. And I'm still probably not fully happy with it. But I think over time, it's been a journey of seeing that we can create that space, that idea, that values, even if everything is not absolutely perfect. So that's, I think, one of those things. And then also the thing about, not always relying on verbal communication. So having alternative forms of communication, including art-based tools. So not just with children, we've done this with adults also, because we design tools for organizations and frontline workers. So we've done like these different sets of tools for maybe identifying emotions. So, sharing a list of emotion charts or just different expressions. What feels right for you today? Where do you feel today? And then also knowing that sometimes we can do anonymous sharing in circles as well. That's been interesting because in organizational circles, sometimes we've created these anonymous polls, etc. And we've seen people might want to share more on that, especially when it's things about difficulties in the workspace, fears in the workspace. So people are more comfortable maybe sharing anonymously even sometimes. So I think my learning here being that it's just a blend. It doesn't have to be one way. It really, really depends. And sometimes what may seem imperfect might actually have a lot of value. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. I believe that's the key: flexibility, creativity, and I totally agree with you. I don't use the talking piece anymore. It doesn't make sense for me in the various spaces that I work. Sometimes it creates tension and creates some ideas that it doesn't really work. It doesn't really need the talking piece, I think. So when we need dialogue, and you can create space for dialogue in a lot of different ways, as you said. Thank you, Arti. Miguel, you talking about circles in in the nature and the importance of this space and etc. One of the central ideas that I use in my work is the idea of ecosophy, or the three ecologies of Félix Guattari. So I always try to create space for people to talk about their own ecology, talking about themselves, their emotions, etc. This social ecology, how they relate with each other, and etc. And it's very important to talk about this nature ecology, which is, for me, includes the very building that we are on. So I have, my wife is a psychologist and an architect. She studies the importance of the building in your health, in mental health, or physical health, in your relations. So I had 2 or 3 opportunities to run circles in an open space. It's not usual. So my question to you is, how can we create some space inside a building, inside a room, and etc., that can try to emulate some of the beauties and the possibilities that we found out in these open spaces? You think it's possible? What can we do to achieve that?
Wow, wonderful question, Paulo. So I recently got trained as a forest therapy guide. And so I've had a chance to study, and I've also been part of a group that looks at well-being in nature. And so there are several things that can be done. The first, as you mentioned, is really designing buildings to incorporate nature. And so there's a whole movement of what is called biophilia, where you use natural materials, where you incorporate nature. Like, for example, you can have a tree growing and it's going right through the house. You can have waterfalls or water going through your house. These are all ways of doing that. But when that is not available, there are several things that you can do. You can bring plants to your office space. Like if you're facilitating a circle in a conference room, maybe you can take the big table out, bring some plants for your centerpiece. Other ideas are to bring, like they have those large posters of forests or mountains. You could also do something as simple as showing a video of nature before you start. Okay, we're going to hold this circle. Let's just take a time to observe and be present to the moment. So I think those are some ways that we can incorporate that. But I love your question, Paulo, because it really reflects that other level that we need, that's so vital to us to really connect with our environment, connect with nature. And there are so many different forms of nature and so many ways of doing so. So thank you.
Thank you, Miguel. I believe it's that connection. We need that in all levels. Thank you. Thank you very much. Claire?
I remember on another webinar with Flor Garcia that Miguel has mentioned, working with her, where she mentioned we're putting water in the center of the circle, and I just thought that's so beautiful. That's so interesting. And listening to you, I remembered about the talking piece, because I do continue to use the talking piece when possible. I'm now, being safe about health restrictions and everything, is how to figure those things out. I am a big fan of the talking piece, but it came to my attention that before the pandemic, once the conversation came up about, oh, do you worry about the talking piece going hand to hand because of germs? And one of the people from the small community that we were there said, oh, thank you for bringing it up, because I'm thinking about that all the time. And it was bothering her, and I didn't know. So I thought, oh, we always need to continue to question ourselves and to ask the community and to figure out what's going on. This hour has flown by for me, and I just want to learn more from all of you. Oh, go ahead, Paulo.
Two simple ideas for that matter. A group of teachers who are facilitated practitioners here in Brazil are using soccer ball. So they pass around in their feet, not in their hands, It's an amazing idea. It works very arty for children. It's an amazing idea. Another thing is, I was in Mexico running trainings when this pandemic started. So in the very first training that I had this challenge, they used that idea. They talked with the hand in their heart. So the talking piece is symbolized with that movement. It was so intense and so interesting. So we must be creative and have flexibility.
I love that. That's so beautiful. So Miguel, Paulo, and Arti, different resources, recommendations, and your contact info that you are willing to share, I'm going to put on the description of the video. Thank you so much for this. I just want to do a very quick final goodbye go around with a question, asking you to share what's something that brings you hope in your own context about restorative justice. And this time I would like to ask, whom of you would like to go first, and then decide who you pass the word to?
I'll be glad to go first. One thing that brings me hope is that the restorative justice movement is happening all over the globe. Just the very fact that we can have Paulo from Brazil and Arti from India, and the two of us from Costa Rica, to me that brings hope, that this is something that is going all around the globe.
I can speak. I totally agree with you, Miguel. These opportunities, not only these ideas being spread around the world, but the chance that we had to meet each other, it's something that will never happen in person meetings. It's so difficult to travel around the world. It's so expensive for people like us. Our currency is so weak. It's very difficult for us. But with this, we can be at any time, in any place, anywhere. So it's amazing. That's one of the things that excites me. But the thing that has excited me the most in the past years is the fact that they are demanding most in-depth courses in supervision and so on. They are willing to understand in depth what they're doing. They're not just the trainings for start to facilitate in circles or conferencing and etc. But a lot of people are really trying to understand what's happening behind this under the surface of this practices. So that's the thing that been very interesting for me in the past years.
Yes, I can go next. Thank you. Actually, very similar. Yeah, seeing the work expand here, and now it's really picking up this so many different contexts. But what really gives me hope, I think, is seeing circles in particular work in so many different contexts with so many different bunches of people, irrespective of literacy, age, gender, even online. Initially, I know I'm so skeptical, but now seeing that work and seeing that that feeling that after the circle, you know, the warmth in the heart, that lightness, etc. So that always gives me hope after every circle that this work really has the potential to transform lives, relationships.
Thank you so much. To me, this conversation brought me so much hope. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day, evening, afternoon, already close to midnight for you, right? So yeah, and thank you so much, everybody. Let's continue to build community. Have a wonderful rest of your week.
A big hug from you to you from Brazil. Bye-bye.
Bye from Costa Rica.